Her father traded her for a sack of flour and a bottle of whiskey at 20. The axe stuck in the round, and I had to wrench it loose with both hands. That's what I remember, the axe stuck, and then I heard the wagon. You get a feel for the sounds on your own land. A wagon on the Kelso Road sounds different than one cutting down through the pine brake, different again than one coming up from the creek crossing. This one was coming up the creek crossing, and it was moving fast for that grade. Too fast. Like whoever was driving didn't know the rut on the left side that'll catch a wheel and throw the whole rig sideways if you hit it above a walk. I set the axe down in the stump and walked to the corner of the barn. It was Deke Pruitt's wagon. I knew it by the cracked sideboard and the gray horse. The gray horse was an animal I had helped pull out of a bog hole 2 springs prior, and Deke had never thanked me for it and had never spoken of it again, which told you what you needed to know about Deke Pruitt. He pulled up harder than he needed to, and the gray stumbled on the stop. He didn't get down. There was someone on the seat beside him, a young woman. She had a burlap sack on her lap about the size of a man's boot, and that appeared to be everything she owned. She was looking straight ahead. Not at me, not at Deke, not at the mountains. Straight ahead at nothing, the way a person looks when they are working very hard on not being somewhere. Deke said, "Harlan, got a proposition." I didn't say anything. I'd learned years before that the less you said to Deke Pruitt, the faster he ran out of road. He said his daughter, this was Nora, I'd seen her twice in town and didn't know more than her name, had become a burden he could not sustain. His words, a burden he could not sustain. He had a debt to Milt Carver at the feed store, a debt that had been sitting since the previous autumn and was not getting smaller, and Milt had agreed to forgive it in exchange for something of value. He used that phrase too, something of value. He looked at me and said he figured I needed a woman around the place and that Milt didn't want her. Milt already had a wife and hadn't wanted Nora specifically, had just wanted something he could sell onward. And so Deke had told Milt he'd get him the flour and the whiskey another way, and had driven out here instead because he'd heard I was looking. I had never said I was looking for anything. The girl still hadn't moved her eyes. I said, "How old is she?" Deke said 20. I was 43 years old. I had 160 acres, a barn in better shape than the house, a well that ran clean year-round, and I had not been warm next to another person in 11 years. That is its own kind of hunger. I want to be honest about that. I am not going to stand here and tell you I was acting purely from charity. I knew what loneliness felt like by then, the way you know what cold feels like. It was just always there, something you worked around. But I looked at the side of that girl's face and I thought, her father is sitting 3 feet away from her, and he is selling her, and she is 20 years old. I said, "This isn't how it works." Deke started to argue. I said, "Get down." He got down slowly because men like Deke Pruitt respect a man who doesn't raise his voice. The quiet ones are the ones who have already decided. I walked to the other side of the wagon and I looked up at her. She looked down at me then, first time. Her eyes were dark, not brown exactly, a color I can't name well, the color of creek water in November when the light is low. She had a bruise along her jaw that was 4 or 5 days old, gone yellow at the edges. She'd been trying to cover it with her hair. I said, "Miss Pruitt, my name is Harlan Cade. I own this land. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go. That includes here." She looked at me for a long time. Then she looked at her father. Then she climbed down from the wagon on her own and stood in my yard with the burlap sack under her arm. Deke looked at me like he expected something. Money, maybe, or thanks. Some acknowledgement that a transaction had occurred. I said, "The rut on your left rear is worn through to the wood. You're going to lose that wheel before you get home if you keep riding the brake." He stood there another moment and then he got back on the wagon and he drove away. I never spoke to Deke Pruitt again. He was dead within 2 years. Took a bad fever that winter and never came out of it. I can't say I grieved him. I showed her the house. I am not going to tell you it was much. The house was log and mud chink, 2 rooms, a sleeping loft up a ladder in the back, a stone fireplace that drew well on 3 sides and sulked on the 4th depending on the wind. I'd been there 12 years and it looked like it. The table was solid, the chairs were solid, I'd made them myself, but the curtains were rotted at the hems, and there was a smell in the back room in summer that I'd never fully found the source of. She walked through it without speaking and without touching anything, the way you walk through a place when you're deciding whether it's a cage. I showed her the loft. I told her that was where she'd sleep. I'd move my things down to the main room. She started to say something and I said it wasn't a negotiation and I wasn't asking for anything in return. I meant sleep when I said sleep, and I meant the loft when I said the loft, and both of those things would remain true for as long as she was here and she could leave any time she chose. She said, "Why?" I said I didn't know exactly. I said it seemed like the right thing. She looked at me. Men don't do right by women without wanting something. I said, "I expect you've earned that opinion." She didn't say anything to that. I said there was water in the pitcher on the bench, soap on the shelf above it, and I'd be outside if she needed anything. I went out and I went back to splitting wood, and I didn't look toward the house for the rest of the afternoon. The first week was quiet in a way that had weight to it. She was up before me. I don't know when she slept. I'd wake in the gray dark and there would already be a sound in the other room, something small, a cup set down, a chair moved an inch. She cooked. Not because I asked her to, she just did it. The first morning I came down from the loft. I'd given her the loft. I was sleeping by the fire on a bedroll I'd used on cattle drives and had never felt the need to replace. And there was cornbread in the pan and coffee on the hook, and she was sitting at the table with her hands around her cup looking out the window. I sat down, we ate. I said thank you. She said nothing. I went out to work. It went like that for most of that first week. She was not cold. She was careful. There is a difference, and it took me time to feel the difference. Cold is a thing turned away from you. Careful is a thing watching to see if it's safe to turn toward. She asked me on the 4th day what I needed done. I told her the truth. I could run the place alone. I had been running it alone. I wasn't going to give her a list of chores as if she owed me labor. She said she needed to be useful or she would lose her mind. I said I understood that. I said there was a kitchen garden that I'd let go to weeds and a half-finished chicken coop I hadn't had time to complete, and if either of those interested her, she was welcome to them. She asked if I had tools. I showed her where I kept them. By the end of the week, the garden was turned and staked, and she'd finished 3 sides of the coop using mortise joints I would not have improved on. I looked at those joints for a long time. I went inside and asked her where she'd learned to cut a joint like that. She said her grandfather before he died. She said he was the one person in her family who treated her like she had a mind. I said it was good work. She said, "I know." First time I saw anything close to lightness in her face. Her name was Nora, and she was the youngest of 4 children and the only daughter, and that had meant in the Prout household that she was the one who worked while the boys were given rope enough to fail at whatever they chose. Her mother had died when Nora was 11. After that, there was no buffer between her and her father's judgment of what she was worth, which was not much. She didn't tell me all of this at once. It came out in pieces over months, a sentence at supper, a thing said while she was working and not looking at me. People tell you things when they're doing something else. I've found that to be true. Sitting still face to face, that's not how it comes. It comes when hands are occupied and eyes are on the work. I didn't push, I asked nothing, I just stayed put. I want to say something about that, about staying put. It sounds like nothing. Men think doing something means moving. It means action, intervention, the large gesture. But there is a thing that steady presence does over time that no gesture can do. You just stay. Day after day you are there and you are the same and nothing bad happens. That is not nothing. For some people that is everything they have never had. October brought the first cold. I came in one evening and found her at the fireplace, and the fire was wrong, built too flat. It was going to smoke badly once it caught and the wind shifted. I said nothing. I got down next to her and I rebuilt the back half of it. One log moved, the angle changed, and the draw went clear. She watched my hands. Then she said, "Show me." I showed her. We sat there on the hearthstone side by side, and I showed her how the back of the fire needs height to draw and where to set the green wood so it dries before it burns. She was 3 feet away. I could feel the warmth off her arm. When I finished talking, she said, "You're patient." I said I was just explaining. She said, "My father never explained anything. He just showed you that you'd done it wrong." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I stood up and went to wash before supper. When I came back, she'd moved the green log exactly where I'd shown her, and the fire was drawing clean. She found the photograph in November. I had it in a tin box under the floorboard in the main room. I'm not sure how she knew it was there, maybe a board that sat wrong. Maybe she'd noticed me avoid walking on that spot. I don't know. I came in from the high pasture, and she was sitting at the table with the tin open and the photograph in her hand. I stopped in the door. She looked up and then looked down at the photograph and said, "Who is she?" I sat down at the other end of the table. I said her name was Ellen. She waited. I said Ellen had been my wife for 3 years. She'd come out from Ohio with her family when I was 31. Her father hadn't approved of me, but she'd married me anyway, and we'd started the place together. The first winter was bad. The second winter she got sick. Not badly sick at first, a cough that wouldn't clear. By spring it had gone into her chest, and by June she was gone. Nora set the photograph flat on the table. She put her finger on it, not on Ellen's face, on the edge. She said, "You've been alone since then." I said 11 years. She didn't say I'm sorry. People say I'm sorry because they don't know what else to say. She didn't say anything for a long time, and then she said, "She looks like she was stubborn." I said Ellen was the most stubborn person I had ever met, and that it was one of the things I'd loved best about her. Nora smiled. A real one. It was quick. It went away fast, but it was the first real one I'd seen, and it stayed with me after. She put the photograph back and closed the tin and set it on the table between us. She said, "You should keep that where you can see it." I said I wasn't sure I could do that yet. She said, "When you're ready, then." I put the tin under the floorboard again that night, but I thought about what she said. In December, a man came to the property. His name was Orville Carver. He was Milt Carver's nephew, not a relation I'd known about, and he was not a man I'd have chosen to know. He rode in on a Sunday when I was mending fence on the south line and found Nora alone in the yard. She told me about it that evening. Her voice was even, but her hands weren't. She was holding her cup with both, and her knuckles were wrong. He'd told her that his Uncle Milt had a claim on her, that the debt her father had made had not actually been forgiven but transferred, and that she belonged to the Carvers until the debt was settled, and since she had no money, the debt would never be settled, and she understood what that meant. He'd smiled when he said it. She said when she'd told him she was under my protection, he'd laughed. I asked her what kind of laugh. She said the kind that means the person thinks you're not a serious obstacle. I got up and I got my coat. She said, "Harlan." I turned around. She said he had 2 men with him on the road. They waited out of sight while he came in. I put on my coat and I buckled my belt, and I went to the gun rack and took down the .44 440 and loaded it and stood there a moment. And then I took down the shotgun too and loaded both barrels and set it on the table. She watched all of this. I said, "Lock the door after I leave. Don't open it for anyone but me." She said, "I'm not going to hide in the house." I said I wasn't asking her to hide. I was asking her to be in a position where I didn't have to split my attention. She looked at me for a moment, and then she nodded. I went out and I rode to Milt Carver's place. I am not going to give you a lot of detail about what happened at Carver's. Not because it was unlawful, it wasn't, and not because I'm ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed of it. There are things a man does that need doing, and the doing of them is simple, and the talking of them afterward is the part that gets overdressed. I will say this. Milt Carver was a man who did business by leverage. He found what people needed, and he put himself between them and it, and then he waited to see what they'd give. He'd done it to Deke Pruitt, and he'd done it to a dozen other men on the flats, and nobody had ever pushed back hard enough to make it stop being worth his while. I pushed back. I told him what the law said about debt transfer when the debtor was a person, rather than property. I told him I'd already spoken to the county magistrate, which I had not, but I intended to the following morning, and the point was not technically false so much as early, and that if Orville Carver set foot on my land again, I would file a complaint that would bring the magistrate and 2 deputies from Garfield, and that Milt's books would need to be open and accurate for that visit, and I suspected they were neither. Milt Carver looked at me across his kitchen table, and I looked back. He was a man who was used to people looking away first. I didn't look away. After a while he said, "No harm was intended." I said, "I know the difference between intended and done. You come near her again, and I'll show you the difference." I rode home. Nora was not in the house. She was on the porch. She'd built a fire in the iron pot I used for rendering, and she was sitting beside it in my spare coat because hers wasn't heavy enough, and she had the shotgun across her knees. I looked at the shotgun, and I looked at her. She said I wasn't hiding. I got off my horse and I stood there in the yard, and I felt something in my chest that I don't have a clean word for. It was not tenderness exactly, and it was not pride exactly. It was the feeling of a thing fitting, like a plumb line going true. I said I talked to Carver. She said I figured. I said he won't be back. She looked at me for a long time, and then she nodded once. Then she stood up and handed me the shotgun and went inside. The winter was hard that year. The snow came before Christmas and didn't leave until late March, and in between there were 2 weeks in February that were as cold as anything I'd felt in 43 years on this earth. The water in the pitcher froze solid overnight. The barn needed tending every 4 hours or the pipes would go and we'd lose the stock. We worked, that's what you do. You put your head down and you work, and you don't think about the cold, because the moment you start thinking about it, it gets inside you. She was up at 2 in the morning and 4 and 6, and I was the same. We passed each other in the dark, lantern to lantern. I'd be coming in as she was going out. We didn't talk much. The cold makes talking expensive, but there is a kind of knowing that grows up between people who endure the same thing together without complaint. You look at a person, and you know what they've already done that morning before you woke up, and you know they didn't ask you to thank them for it, and that is worth more than most conversations. The gelding went down in mid-February. Colic came on fast, and I was in the pasture when it happened, and by the time I got to the barn she'd already had her hands inside him. I'm not going to be delicate about it. When a horse colics badly, you have to work with your hands and your arms inside the animal, and it is hard work, and it is ugly work, and most women I had known in my life would have gone to the house and waited for the man to handle it. She was already halfway done when I got there. We saved the horse. After, we stood in the barn in the lamplight, and we were both covered in mess, and she was blowing hard from the effort, and she looked sideways at me, and then she laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, rough and surprised. The laugh of someone who hasn't laughed in a long time and doesn't know where it came from. I laughed too. I don't remember the last time before that I'd laughed in a barn in winter in the middle of the night. We walked back to the house, and she heated water, and we cleaned up, and she made coffee, and we sat at the table and drank it in the dark with the lamp turned low to save the oil. We didn't speak for a long time. The fire was going well. Snow ticked against the window. She said, "Harlan." I looked up. She said, "I don't know how to say this without it coming out wrong." I waited. She said, "When I was on my father's wagon and I was coming up your road, I was not hoping for anything. I had stopped hoping for things. It hurt less that way." I said I understood that. She said, "I'm not stopped anymore." I didn't say anything. The snow ticked. The fire popped once. She said, "I just wanted you to know." I said, "I'm glad." She nodded and she wrapped both hands around her cup and she looked at the fire, and after a while she said, "Go to sleep, Harlan. You've been up 20 hours. I went to sleep. In March she found a wood thrush. It had hit the window glass and come down stunned in the snow, and she brought it inside in her cupped hands and set it on the table under the lamp to warm. I watched her from across the room. She didn't fuss over it. She just put it there and stepped back and let it be. When it came around, she opened the door and walked outside with it on her palm and stood in the cold without a coat until it flew. She came back in and closed the door. I said, "You could have done that from the doorway." She said it needed a moment to look around before it went. That is the kind of thing she said sometimes, plain but with a bottom to it. Spring came slow, and when it came all at once the way it does out here. One morning there is still gray snow in the shadows, and by afternoon the mud is deep and smelling of turned earth, and the light has changed entirely, warm where it lands on your face. I was plowing the south field when she rode out on the gray horse. She had learned to ride that winter. I hadn't taught her, I'd shown her the basics, and she'd figured out the rest herself, which was how she learned most things. She rode out and pulled up at the edge of the field and sat there watching for a while, and then she rode alongside me for one row without speaking. Then she said, "I went to town this morning." I said I'd seen she'd taken the horse. She said, "I went to see Reverend Aldous." I stopped the plow. The horse stopped and dropped his head and blew. She was looking straight ahead down the furrow. She said, "I know you haven't asked me. I know you said you weren't going to ask me anything. I know all that." She paused. "I'm asking you." I stood there in the mud and the new warm air, and I looked at the side of her face. I said, "Nora." She turned and looked at me. I said, "I have been trying to figure out how to ask you since November." She looked at me for a moment, and then she looked down, and I could see she was holding her breath and letting it out slow. She said, "November." I said, "When you laughed at the fire." She said, "That was a real mess of an evening to decide something like that." I said, "Yeah." She looked up at the mountains. They had snow on them still on the high faces, but the snow was bright now rather than gray, the way it goes in spring when the light comes back. She said, "Reverend Aldous said Saturday." I said Saturday was fine. She nodded. She turned the horse and rode back toward the house. I stood in the mud for a while, and then I went back to plowing. We married on a Saturday in late April in the Aldous Church in Carver Creek. There were 11 people there, most of them people I'd done some work for or with over the years. Bud Flannery from the next valley, who I'd helped pull a fence with, the Sorensen family from up near the timber line, old Clarence Webb, who was 82, and came to everything in town, including things he wasn't invited to, and was welcome everywhere for it. Nobody from Nora's family. She didn't want them there, and I didn't suggest it. She wore a blue dress she had made from cloth she'd bought in town with money she'd saved from selling eggs from the chicken coop she'd built. I had not known she was making it. I had not known she was selling eggs either, not at the scale she'd been doing it. When she came out of the back room in that dress and I saw what she'd done, made a thing of that quality, in secret for this, I had to look at the wall for a moment. She stood beside me at the front of the church, and Reverend Aldous said the words and I said mine, and she said hers in a voice that didn't waver. When it was done, she put her hand in my arm. I covered it with mine. Old Clarence Webb cried, didn't bother to be quiet about it. The summer was good. A good summer on a working ranch is not what people who have never worked land imagine. It is not restful. It is hot and relentless, and there is always something that needs doing before something else that also needs doing. But there is a rightness to it that is hard to put in words, the rightness of hard work that is yours, on land that is yours, beside a person who chose to be there. She was good at everything she turned her hand to, not because she was exceptional in some rare way, though she was not ordinary either, but because she was serious. She worked at a thing until she understood it, and then she did it right. I respected that more than I can say. I had been around people who moved fast and cut corners all my life. She did not cut corners. The garden she'd put in that first spring was producing by July better than it had in the 3 years before she came. She had a system to it that I studied because I was curious. She said her grandfather had taught her, "You plant by what pulls from the soil and what puts back. You don't take from the same ground 2 years running." I said that was how he'd taught her. She said that was how she'd taught herself. She said he'd given her the first idea and she'd worked out the rest. That was her. In August, Terrence Voigt came through. Voigt was a man I'd had trouble with years before Nora, a dispute over a water right on the creek that fed both our properties. He was not a man who let things go. He had come at it sideways, through the county assessor, through a surveyor he'd paid to draw the line wrong, through a letter to the territorial office suggesting I'd filed my original claim incorrectly. None of it had worked. But he was the kind of man who stays at something indefinitely, not because he's passionate about it, but because he doesn't have enough of a life to put the thing down. He came with his foreman and 2 ranch hands, and he came on a Tuesday when I was at the creek cutting the sluice gate. He came to the house first. I didn't know any of this until I came back and found Nora at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and a ledger open in front of her, and Voigt standing across from her looking like he'd been hit somewhere soft and hadn't figured out how to react. I stood in the door. Nora said, without looking up, "Mr. Voigt was just explaining his position on the creek right." I said, "Was he?" She turned a page in the ledger. It was the property ledger I kept in the cabinet, the one with all the filings and surveys and correspondence going back to my original claim. She had found it and read it and opened it to the correct page. She said to Voigt, "The 1874 filing includes the water right in the language of the claim. The 1879 survey your surveyor produced contradicts the 1874 filing, which gives this property the right of prior claim under territorial code. You would need to demonstrate that the 1874 filing was made in error or made fraudulently. You have never demonstrated that because you cannot. I believe that is what Mr. Cade has been saying to you for 8 years. Voigt looked at me. I said nothing. Voigt said, "I was talking to your wife, Cade." I said I noticed. He stood there a while longer and then he left. He didn't come back. After his horses were off the property, I looked at Nora across the kitchen. She closed the ledger and said, "I read everything in that cabinet last winter when we were snowed in. I didn't know if any of it would matter." I sat down across from her. She looked at me and said, "You've been carrying all of this alone for a long time." I said, "I'm not alone now." She put her hand on the table between us. I put mine on hers. That fall I found the tin under the floorboard. Not the first time, I moved it. I did what she'd said. I was ready. I put it on the mantelpiece over the fireplace where I could see it. Nora saw it there and she didn't say anything about it. She didn't ask why I'd moved it or what it meant. She just looked at it once and went on about the evening, which was the right thing. Ellen had been real, and what I'd had with her had been real, and the end of it had been real. And Nora understood that in the way that people who have lost things of their own understand the losses of others, not by talking about them, but by not asking you to put them away. I thought about that sometimes. The 2 of them. Ellen, who had come to me young and we had built from nothing, and she had died before we'd finished the building. Nora, who had come to me with nothing, and we were building something now that I had not expected to have again. Different things, both real. I don't know how to talk about that more precisely than that. The second winter was nothing like the first. Not easier in the way of less work. The work was the same. The cold was the same. But we knew each other by then in the way that takes a full year to accumulate. All the small frictions and small graces of sharing a place and sharing a purpose. The knowledge of how a person moves in a room when they're tired versus when they're in a bad mood versus when they're at peace. The shorthand that grows up between two people who don't waste words. She started calling me Har that winter. Not Harlan, Har, just that one syllable. It startled me the first time. Ellen had called me Harlan always, formal even in private. No one else had ever shortened it. It felt like something being given that you hadn't known was being held. One evening in January we were both at the table. I was working on a harness repair, she was mending something, the lamp between us, the fire behind her. She looked up and said, Har. I looked up. She said, I need you to know something. I waited. She said, the day I came here on that wagon, I had already decided. I want you to understand that. My father thought he was taking me somewhere and leaving me. I had already decided that wherever he was taking me was better than where I was, and that if the man at the end of the road was not a good man, I would leave and find somewhere else. I had a plan. It was not much of a plan, but it was mine. I said I hadn't known that. She said, you looked at me on that wagon and you told me I didn't have to go anywhere I didn't want to go. That was the first time in my life a man said that to me. She paused. So I want to be clear. I am here because I chose it, not because I had nowhere else to go. I looked at her across the lamp. I had thought in the back of my mind, in the way a man thinks things he doesn't say, that she was here because I'd been useful. Because I'd been decent when decent was a low bar. Because I'd been the better option and not necessarily a good one. I said there were other options. There are always other options. She said, I know. I looked at you and I thought that man is real. He's tired and he's worn down and he doesn't want anything from me. And I thought, that's what I want. A man who's real. I had to look down at the harness for a moment. She went back to her mending. The lamp burned. The fire moved behind her and put her hair in light. After a while she said, now stop looking at that harness like it said something to offend you and come sit by the fire. I put the harness down and came and sat by the fire. She put her feet up on the hearth and leaned into me, and we sat like that for a long time without talking. Her weight against my side, the warmth of the fire on both our faces. Outside the snow was coming down the way it does in deep winter, steady and without noise, and the land was covered over and still. And in the morning there would be work, and the day after that there would be more work, and the year would turn the way years turn. And I was 50 years from being young, and the best part of my life was happening now, in this chair, with this woman leaning against me in the firelight, and I had not expected that. I had not expected that. The fire settled. She shifted her weight, and I put my arm around her and she stayed. That is the whole of it, I suppose. That is the whole of what I have to tell you. A man and a piece of land and a woman who chose it with her eyes open, and who is still choosing it, still choosing me. Every morning she gets up and puts on her coat and goes out to the barn. I hear her sometimes before I'm awake. A cup set down, a door. And I know she's already out there, already at work in the cold before the sun is up, already carrying her half of all of it without complaint. I lie there for a moment in the warmth, and I listen to the sound of her being there. That's not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all.